Imagine this. You're in a relationship that both ignites and depletes you. Some days, it's sheer passion, intense, magnetic, addictive. Other days, it feels like you're walking through a war zone in silence. Words turn sharp. Touch becomes tense. Even asking for space becomes a reason to feel guilty. And yet, you stay. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because some part of you has convinced itself that this chaos is love, that this instability is just the price you pay for something meaningful, something real. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most toxic relationships don't look toxic in the beginning. They often arrive dressed in affection, attention, and seductive promises of something rare. But over time, quietly, almost invisibly, affection becomes control, care becomes surveillance, connection becomes dependency. You don't realize it at first. You just begin to feel guilty for being yourself, ashamed for needing rest, anxious for asking too much, as if simply existing as your own person means you're being selfish. Maybe you've lived this, or maybe you've watched someone else shrink inside it. They say things like, "He's just like that because he loves me so much," or "She's only jealous because she's afraid to lose me," all while justifying behavior that's draining their very life force. There are relationships where saying no is enough to trigger silence, withdrawal, or rage, where even the desire for 5 minutes of peace becomes an accusation of betrayal. And then comes the most damaging part. You begin to doubt yourself. Am I being dramatic? Is the problem me? Maybe I'm just too sensitive. And slowly, your sense of reality begins to fracture. This is one of the most sinister marks of toxicity. It rewires your perception. It wears down your self-trust. It makes survival feel like love, and pain feel like proof of depth. This video is not about blame. It is not about shaming. It's a mirror, a chance to confront what you've been calling love, but that may actually be emotional self-destruction. Together, we'll explore 7 psychological signs that you may be in a toxic relationship, rooted in the insights of some of the greatest minds in psychology, especially Carl Jung. Here, you won't find cliches. You'll find truths, hard truths, but liberating ones. Because once you finally see the invisible, once you name the subtle destruction, you gain back something essential: your clarity. If you're ready to look with courage, to stop just surviving and start understanding, then keep watching. Because what's coming next may hurt, but it might also set you free. The reason some of the most toxic bonds are hardest to leave is because they offer something that looks like love, but is not. Intensity, emotional highs, heart-pounding reconciliations after explosive fights, possessiveness disguised as passion. It feels addictive, and the more painful it is, the more real it seems. But intensity is not proof of love. It is proof of entanglement. It is a trap. Freud called it the compulsion to repeat, our unconscious drive to recreate unresolved childhood wounds in adult relationships, hoping, without knowing, that this time, we'll finally be loved the way we weren't before. And Carl Jung went further. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So perhaps this love story you're clinging to is not a story of destiny, but a pattern, begging to be broken. If you were raised in an environment where love and pain always came together, where affection was followed by punishment, where warmth turned cold without warning, then your nervous system learned something dangerous. It learned that love must hurt to feel real, that uncertainty is proof of depth, that being thrown off balance is part of the experience. So when you enter a relationship full of emotional turbulence, you don't run from it. You recognize it. You say, "This feels familiar." But what feels familiar is not love. It's trauma. Eric Fromm explored this when he described symbiotic love, a type of attachment in which two people blur into each other. Not out of true intimacy, but out of emotional dependency. It feels like connection, but what it really is fusion, the kind where neither person remains whole. And inside this dynamic, drama becomes normal, arguments become routine, silences feel louder than words, jealousy is mistaken for care, and chaos becomes the measure of how much someone feels for you. Intensity is confused with love, but intensity is not love. It is imbalance. It is instability dressed up as romance. And for those addicted to emotional adrenaline, true love feels boring. Calmness feels suspicious. Consistency feels fake. That's because the brain, especially one wired by childhood instability, gets hooked on the emotional roller coaster. When you're constantly thrown between tension and relief, your brain releases dopamine, not just in the highs, but in the lows too. You become chemically addicted to conflict, to chaos, to that person who makes you feel like you're alive, even if what you're feeling is pain. And here lies the cruelest twist of all. The stronger the emotional storm, the deeper the illusion that this must be something special. You tell yourself, "No one has ever made me feel like this." And that may be true. But what you're feeling isn't love. It's the reactivation of an old wound, one that never had the chance to fully heal. And that's why letting go feels like dying. Because to release this person is to accept that this pain is yours, not theirs, yours. And yet, another illusion forms, one that's just as seductive. You begin to believe you can save them. That if you love hard enough, long enough, purely enough, they will change. The fights will stop. The emotional distance will close. The chaos will calm. And suddenly, you are no longer just a partner. You are a healer, a guide, a rescuer. But this isn't love anymore. It's a mission to fix what is broken. Not in them, but in you. It's a desperate attempt to make the pain meaningful. To prove that you matter enough to transform someone. That your love is powerful enough to tame a storm. Carl Jung called this projection. It's when we take parts of ourselves, parts we've disowned, rejected, feared, and cast them onto the people we love. You deny your own insecurity. So you attract someone who is insecure and try to heal them. You repress your rage. So you fall for someone volatile and try to calm them. It's not just about them. It's your shadow, reflected back to you. Fromm described this in another way. Neurotic love. The kind of love that isn't free, but tied to performance, to feeling useful, to being needed in order to feel worthy. In this type of love, you are not loving. You are compensating. And until you recognize this pattern, you will keep calling it love, but it will keep breaking you. You may think what you're feeling is love, but in reality, it's a psychological contract, a bond fueled not by connection, but by compulsion. Eric Fromm described this perfectly. A kind of love that is never free. It demands a price, a sacrifice. It has to be earned, not through mutual growth, but through your silence. Your effort, your constant emotional labor. And that's exactly where you begin to lose yourself in the relationship. The harder you try to fix it, the more frustrated you become. The more they resist change, the more you double down on saving them. And when it all starts to fall apart, you don't blame them. You blame yourself for not being enough, for not trying harder, for not loving better. But here's the truth. You're not in a relationship. You're on an emotional battlefield, fighting against wounds that were never yours to heal, fighting to prove that if you love hard enough, you'll finally be enough. But love is not rehabilitation. And every moment you spend trying to rescue someone who doesn't want to be rescued, you break a little more. You lose pieces of yourself. Day by day, your voice, your will, your sense of self. It starts slowly. At first, you still have an identity. You know your preferences, your goals, your boundaries. But as time passes, that clarity begins to dissolve. You defer to them more often. You second-guess your opinions. You hesitate to express needs, for fear they'll trigger distance, punishment, or emotional withdrawal. And before you know it, you've become a shadow. What do you want? You're not sure. What do you need? You hesitate to answer. Who are you outside this relationship? You don't remember. This is one of the most dangerous and subtle signs of a toxic relationship. The erosion of identity. Erich Fromm called it symbiotic fusion, a psychological merger that strips both people of individuality. It's not intimacy. It's not closeness. It's a collapse of personal boundaries disguised as connection. And Freud warned us of the same in his theory of ego repression. When we suppress our needs and impulses to maintain peace or avoid abandonment, we're not being kind. We're being erased. You stop expressing anger. You hide your pain. You numb your own desires. And little by little, you become exactly what the other person needs you to be. Not because they asked, but because you learned to survive that way. You change how you dress. You stop seeing certain friends. You abandon hobbies, interests, dreams, anything that might make waves. And every time you bend yourself into a smaller version of who you were, you call it compromise. But it's not. It's disappearance. And here's the tragedy. This loss of identity doesn't always come with a loud, visible breakdown. No, it arrives as quiet emptiness, as apathy, as chronic fatigue. You feel like something is wrong, but you can't quite name it. And when, finally, you try to reclaim your space, your voice, your boundaries, you're met with guilt. You're told you're selfish for needing time. You're told your silence is abandonment. You're told your boundaries are attacks. Because in a toxic relationship, autonomy is treated like betrayal. And that's where we go next. In the following section, we'll examine how toxic dynamics turn healthy distance into emotional sin, and how guilt becomes a weapon that keeps you trapped. Autonomy, in a toxic relationship, slowly morphs into something forbidden. What should be a natural expression of self becomes labeled as selfishness. You begin to feel guilty for wanting to sleep alone, for not replying to a message immediately, for going out with friends and not explaining every detail. You start to believe that taking care of yourself is a betrayal. The most dangerous part? This guilt is rarely imposed directly. It doesn't arrive as orders or shouting. It sneaks in through subtle cues, sighs, glances, long silences, emotional phrases like, "You've changed," "You don't love me anymore," or the emotionally manipulative, "If it were me, I would never treat you like this." Freud described this internal machinery as the punitive superego, an inner critic shaped by authoritarian voices, constantly policing your desires, making you feel guilty for simply having needs. In toxic relationships, this internal voice grows louder every day, amplified by the other's reactions. Soon, you begin to anticipate guilt before it even arrives. You silence yourself to avoid conflict. You deny your own truth before it even has the chance to be spoken. You live in a state of psychological surveillance, where every step is calculated to prevent emotional explosions. And the effect is suffocating. You stop breathing deeply. You stop laughing freely. You stop being. You become a version of yourself that is always edited, always present, always agreeable, always afraid. Behind this learned submission is a deep unconscious belief that to love is to erase yourself, that self-care is selfish, that space equals abandonment. But what happens if you stop taking responsibility for their emotional chaos? What if the guilt you carry is not even yours to begin with? That question brings us to the next layer of toxicity. The moment when guilt turns into emotional captivity. When you don't just feel bad for pulling away. You begin to believe that you are responsible for the other's suffering. You tell yourself, I can't leave. They need me. They only act this way because they've been hurt. And so you stop being a partner and start becoming a caregiver. The more fragile they appear, the more necessary you feel. It creates a powerful illusion that your love is the only thing keeping them from falling apart, that your absence would break them completely. But ask yourself, is this really love, or is it emotional imprisonment wearing the mask of compassion? Carl Jung warned about this phenomenon in his study of archetypes. He described the unconscious identification with the martyr, the savior who sacrifices everything to rescue another, even if it means burning themselves in the process. What looks like nobility from the outside is often a sign of deep disconnection from one's own worth. Eric Fromm called this neurotic love, a type O, but by emotional addiction, fear, and unconscious need. You're not staying because you want to. You're staying because you feel you must. And in that, the other's pain becomes a silent form of control. Not always intentional, but just as powerful. Every tear, every outburst, every dramatic collapse becomes another invisible thread tying you to the relationship. But here is the harsh truth, one that few are willing to face. You are not responsible for healing pain that the other refuses to confront. Your presence cannot rescue someone who has no intention of changing. At best, it delays their fall. At worst, it drags you down with them. And perhaps the most disturbing part of all this is that behind your endless sacrifice, there's something hauntingly familiar, an emotional déjà vu, as if this suffering, this self-erasure, this constant emotional labor, had already been written into your story long ago. It's not the first time you've felt this way. And that's because you're not just reacting to the relationship in front of you. You're reliving something deeper, something from the past. In the next section, we'll dive into this hidden layer. Why, even when you swear you'll never suffer like this again, you find yourself walking the same emotional path with a different face. Why you call it fate, but it might actually be a pattern rooted in unresolved childhood wounds. Have you ever felt like you keep dating the same person over and over? Even when the names and faces change, like the universe is playing some cruel joke, repeating the same heartbreak, the same abandonment, the same silence that once again becomes unbearable? This isn't chance. It's a psychological loop, and Freud gave it a name, repetition compulsion. He described it as the unconscious drive to recreate the emotional injuries of childhood. Not because we enjoy suffering, but because we are trying, again and again, to rewrite the ending, to win this time, to finally be seen, loved, protected. So you're drawn to people who feel familiar, people who trigger that old ache. Because deep down, a part of you still believes, if I can just make this one love me, I'll finally prove that I was worthy all along. Freud also explained the mechanism of transference, that we don't really fall in love with who's in front of us, but with the emotional ghosts of our past. And when we meet someone who echoes the same absence, the same volatility, The same cold indifference of a parent or early caregiver. It feels like home, even if that home hurt us. But the tragedy is this: you're not healing anything, you're just repeating the wound. And with every cycle, you become smaller, more exhausted, more convinced that maybe love is supposed to feel like this. And then comes the darkest twist. You begin to believe that this pain is normal, that calm is boring, that peace is emptiness, that when someone doesn't trigger your wounds, they must not be the one. So even when you realize you're stuck in a pattern, even when the pain becomes unbearable, you hesitate, because as terrifying as it is to keep hurting, there's something even more terrifying: not knowing who you are without that hurt. And it is precisely this fear, the fear of the void, of starting over, of facing yourself without the noise, that we will confront in the final part. When your identity becomes entangled with the relationship, leaving doesn't feel like leaving a person. It feels like losing your very shape, as if the one you were with held the only mirror in which you could recognize yourself. And without them, the reflection vanishes. Without them, you don't know who you are. Eric Fromm complements this perfectly when he states, "Many people don't love as an expression of freedom, but as an escape. Escape from the terror of solitude. Escape from meeting themselves in silence. Escape from the unanswered questions that echo through the stillness." This kind of love isn't rooted in choice. It's not conscious. It's anesthesia. You stay, not because you believe in the future of the relationship, but because the emptiness of absence feels more unbearable than the pain of staying. Because deep down, some part of you still believes that familiar suffering is safer than unfamiliar freedom. And this is not weakness. This is not cowardice. It is the echo of an ancient wound. The wound of never having been taught how to be whole without another. The wound of having never learned how to stand beside yourself, without abandoning yourself in the process. Perhaps no one ever showed you how to love yourself in solitude. How to set boundaries without guilt. How to exist without constantly needing someone else to affirm your worth. How to breathe deeply without apologizing for taking up space. But let this be the beginning. Because the truth is this: you will only be able to experience real love when you no longer have to lose yourself in order to be loved. When you no longer see sacrifice as the price of belonging. Love is not meant to shrink you. It is not meant to erase you or burn you down to be reborn as someone else. Love is meant to help you grow, to expand what is already there. It should amplify your soul, not bury it. If that's not what you're living, then maybe it's time to stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Why'd I still call this love?" You deserve something better. Not perfect, but honest. Not flawless, but mutual. But before you can find it outside, you have to reclaim it inside. Courage is not the absence of pain. It's not the absence of fear. Courage is the decision to be loyal to yourself, even when everything around you tries to make you forget who you are. And now I want to hear from you. Which part of this reflection struck a nerve? Which truth was the hardest to look at? Let me know in the comments. Because sometimes, the act of writing, of naming your experience, is already the first step in breaking the cycle. And don't stop here. The next video is just as important. Maybe even more so. It's the next piece of the puzzle. The next page in your liberation. You've already begun the journey. Now, take the next step.